tries to get you down, it's the perfect time for a rebound. It's my turn. Let's take it to another level.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Florida Atlantic University President John Kelly.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to the Alan B. and Charna Larkin Symposium on the American Presidency. Each year, Florida Atlantic University hosts this wonderful event with Charna Larkin in honor of her late husband, Alan B. Larkin, and his fervent passion for American history, particularly American presidencies. While Alan spent his career as a publisher of trade magazines for the fashion industry, our nation's history is what really fascinated him. He was even known for accruing an impressive collection of original letters signed by every American president, from George Washington to George W. Bush. But Alan himself was also a great man, one with a great deal of pride for his country and particularly for his family. It is in his memory that Charna and her family so graciously dedicated the endowment that has supported these symposia since 2007, effectively furthering the study of American presidency and ensuring that Alan's legacy continues. Additionally, the gift supports graduate fellowships and undergraduate scholarships for FAU students who are interested in pursuing studies of the American presidency. Not only is this a worthwhile area of research, it is a necessary one. As Americans and as academics, we have a tremendous responsibility to critically examine the foundations of our country and resolve to create a better future for all who live here. This includes exploring the role of the presidency and understanding how it shapes the political, cultural, and social developments throughout America. I believe that through Charna's philanthropy, along with the combined efforts of our students and our faculty, this important work is indeed taking place here at Florida Atlantic University. Leading this responsibility is FAU Professor of History, prize-winning author, and director of the Alan B. and Charna Larkin Symposium on the American Presidency, Dr. Stephen Engel. Dr. Engel is an exceptionally accomplished scholar who we are proud to have in the Dorothy F. Schmidt College of Arts and Letters. Listen to his accolades. He is a past Fulbright Scholar in Germany, a C-SPAN lecturer in American history, an Andrew Mellon Fellow, a current distinguished lecturer of the Organization of American Historians, a lecturer for the Smithsonian Institute's Associates Program, and in 2016, he was named Florida Atlantic University's Distinguished Professor of the Year. That is the most outstanding teacher at the university. In 2019, he was supported and moved to FAU's athletic programs as a representative to the NCAA, so he has many dimensions to his program. Dr. Engel, I want to tell you how much we appreciate you with your remarkable accomplishments, your dedication to this symposium, to our students, and to the university. The impact of your leadership is indeed impacting all of us. I am thrilled to see what you have planned for this evening, and I know, like years past, this will be a great symposium. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Stephen Engel.
Wow. Thank you, President Kelly. On behalf of my colleagues and all the staff who have helped bring this symposium about, I'm absolutely delighted you're here. It's been 2 years since we've gathered in the Barry K. I'm so glad to see you back in support of our mission here in the Alan B. Larkin Symposium on the American Presidency. Before I introduce our guests, I want to make sure that you know there's a book signing afterwards. Books are available in the lobby. But if you are going to be in the book signing line, we'd like you to exit on this side, so that will help clear the traffic for exiting on the other side. I know what a struggle it probably was for Tom Friedman and Tim Naftali, both in New York and Washington, D.C., to come here in February at Boca. Real hardship for them. I'm just so thankful President's Day is in February. I never knew Alan Larkin, but I'm keenly aware of his legacy. Look around. It's because of his love and passion for history, and especially the study of the American presidency, that we're all here today. So thanks to his wonderful family and his remarkable and lovely wife, Charna, for making today possible. Born in 1922, 100 years ago, Alan was part of what Tom Brokaw called America's greatest generation, which made a lot of history, by the way. They fought a great world war, they suffered through a Cold War, they advanced our civil rights, and they tolerated my generation of the bell-bottomed, make love not war Beatles musical culture of the baby boomers. God bless them. Today, there are only about 75,000 members of this generation remaining with us, but they're easily spotted, not simply by their age, but as Brokaw argues, by how they distinguish themselves. For instance, they assume personal responsibility. They are humble because it is an expected norm of dignity and modesty. They have an incredible work ethic. They are faithfully committed to the enterprise, even if it's digging a trench. And finally, they understand that the facts are undisputable. Truth is something we believe. They demonstrated that ordinary people working with enough collective energy and spirit can do extraordinary things. Alan Larkin displayed these qualities throughout his life, and he and Charna passed these characteristics on to their 3 sons, and I'm sure to their grandchildren. Alan's dedication to business as well as community service was nurtured as a child in Maine by his late father and mother, Joseph and Bessie Larkin. Alan would drive his father, an apparel salesman who became blind, throughout New England to sell his merchandise. Alan himself became a trade show innovator in 1945 with his brother Harold. They founded the Larkin publications that catered to the thriving New England fashion industry. One telling story about this family comes from Alan Larkin's son, David, who recalled, quote, "My dad grew up during the Depression, and he was thankful every day of his life for his family and his success. His motto was simple: you have to do the best thing, the right thing, always." His family has lived this motto. We owe Alan Larkin's generation much. Those who are still with us have even learned the vocabulary of their grandchildren. Words like email and Skype and text and tweet and Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok. I have no idea what that is. But I'm confident Alan Larkin's generation has conquered these new platforms in much the same way they fought against the Axis powers in World War II. another testament to their adaptability. Their new motto could be, we will Instagram them on the beaches. We will Snapchat them on the seas. For 15 years, the Larkin Symposium has been a distinguished program here at FAU. And over the years, we have contributed great people to this stage to expand our understanding of the American presidency. Here at FAU, we're thankful that our president, John Kelly, understands that we need historians as much as we need biochemists and engineers. Much has changed in the world since the Greatest Generation, and especially how people around the globe see the American presidency. It's an enduring question, but today we have the opportunity to think about some answers. So for the next hour, perhaps longer, put aside the knowledge that today's guest, Thomas Friedman, is an internationally renowned author, foreign affairs reporter, and columnist. That he is the recipient of 3 Pulitzer Prizes. That he is the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers, including The World is Flat, which spent 60 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. That he earned his BA from Brandeis and earned a master's degree from Oxford. That after serving as a Beirut reporter for UPI for 2 years, he was hired by the New York Times in 1981, where he served as the Beirut bureau chief, chief diplomatic and economic correspondent, and since 1995, its foreign affairs columnist. And finally, put aside the fact that he is the recipient of the Overseas Press Club Award for Lifetime Achievement and was named to the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth, and that he has been a frequent advisor to several presidents. What matters today is not the fame of Thomas Friedman's work. What matters is his influence, his relevance, and most importantly, his being here today to discuss the American presidency through a global lens. There's a lot to unpackage with today's theme, and when we were in planning stages of this symposium, we couldn't think of anybody better than Dr. Tim Naftali of NYU to serve as moderator. Dr. Naftali is a CNN presidential historian and a professor of public service and history at NYU. He holds degrees from Yale and Harvard and writes on national security, international history, and presidential history. Naftali came to NYU after serving as the founding director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in California, where he authored the library's nationally acclaimed exhibit on Watergate and oversaw the release of 1.3 million pages of presidential documents. Perhaps more relevant to today, he has co-authored with the late Alexandra Fersenko 2 books on Soviet global policy and the Cold War. I'm thrilled that Tim has returned as today's moderator. Over the years, all of our featured speakers have left us more informed about the American presidency, and along the way, they've left us with some memorable quotes. David McCullough, who graced the stage in 2013, said, "You can't be a full participant in our democracy if you don't know our history." Doris Kearns Goodwin was here 2 years ago. She told us that good leadership requires you to surround yourself with people of diverse perspectives who can disagree with you without fear of retaliation. Spoiler alert, today's speaker also has some famous quotes. I'll take one. My personal favorite is when Thomas Friedman wrote The World is Flat, he said, "Yeah, the world is flat. Yeah, we're all connected. Facebook didn't exist. Twitter was a sound. The cloud was in the sky. 4G was a parking place. LinkedIn was a prison. Applications were what you sent to college. And Skype, for the most part, was a typo." I would say Thomas Friedman has a little Mark Twain in him, and you heard it here first. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Tom Friedman and Tim Naftali.
Wow. Can you imagine a better person to be listening to today with Europe on the verge of war than our guest, my guest, Tom Friedman?
Thank you.
It would be easy for us to spend a lot of time talking about Russia, but we, in honor of the Larkin tradition, and with thanks to the Larkin family, especially Charna, we're going to talk about the presidency and put it in perspective. But we will start by talking a little bit about Russia And I'm going to ask you, Tom, how would you assess, to this point, President Biden's handling of this challenge in Eastern Europe?
Well, Tim, first of all, it's great to be with you. Thanks to FAU and the Larkin family. And thank you all for coming out. This is actually my second in-person event in 2 years. First was out in Salt Lake City, and so it's just great to be with people. So thank you all for being here. I would give the president high marks so far. Tim, this is a really delicate dance, but it turns out that Sleepy Joe, the guy some people thought didn't really know the difference between Kiev and Kansas and the AARP from NATO, actually is quite on top of this. The difficulty that he's faced, Tim, is we cannot deter Russia alone. We aren't going to send troops to Ukraine. So how do you generate enough deterrence, primarily economic, but some military, without our sending troops? So that's a giant alliance challenge. And it really requires, first and foremost, bringing Germany along. Because Germany is really the make-weight in the heart of Europe. It's the economic powerhouse. And because Germany holds an enormous asset, a gas pipeline that the Russians want to build to deliver natural gas to Germany. And so far, keeping Italy, Germany, France, and the UK together and generating enough economic pressure up to now on Putin, I think has definitely given him pause. As we sit here, he may invade the rest of Ukraine. But it's definitely given him pause. And I think even more importantly, Tim, and we don't really know, but there are members of the Russian elite, we have to assume, and you know Russia very well, that are not on with this. And if you watched any of the, it was sort of like a bad imitation of North Korea that they did, he did yesterday or the day before, where he had his whole national security team there and went around, and that moment where his chief of intelligence, foreign intelligence, head of the SVR, where they ask him, I think
that's Putin calling in.
That's right. No, put him on hold. But when you're conducting a complete, basically staged event, and your own chief of intelligence basically indicates that he's not entirely with the program, I think that is the tip of a pretty significant iceberg of Russian elites who are asking, really, what is this about? And I think more importantly, my sort of closest Russian friend in the security establishment there emailed me yesterday. And I wish I could read the email, but it basically said, there's one question here that Putin absolutely has not answered. Tell me how this ends. And I think there are a lot of Russians really worried about that.
It's been striking, hasn't it, that he's taken so much time to act. It's as if this is happening in slow motion.
Yeah.
And do you get the sense that maybe this strategist has doubts?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things we know about Putin, and I don't want to be cute about this, but he is a germaphobe, and he has been basically completely isolated for the last 2 years. So only deals with people through Zoom, or the Russian equivalent. And all you had to do was watch those scenes of Macron and the German chancellor visiting him at this, what was it, on a 30-foot long table, with him at one end and them on the other. I mean, that was weird, man. That was just like that. And you really have to ask the question about his own mental stability right now, and does he really know how dire the situation is? Because, and I would say, I was thinking about this the other day, that I'm a big believer, something I learned covering the Middle East, that the most important day in any war is the morning after the morning after. Okay. And so, the morning after, the tanks go in, sometimes people say, yeah, we won. It's the morning after when the full weight of economics, politics, geopolitics are really brought to bear. And what I would say is, if he does go into the rest of Ukraine and try to take Kiev, and the morning after is going to be one of the most dangerous days for the rest of your life, because we will impose crippling sanctions on Russia. And how he then responds to those crippling sanctions. And let's remember, Russia is the other great nuclear power. He's not going to use nuclear weapons, but how he responds is going to be really, really frightening. And it will set the tone for what happens after this. So I'm very, very worried. What Biden did successfully, to get back to the presidency, Tim, is that he constructed with our allies a set of sanctions that were basically saying to Putin, if you do this, it is a bet the farm proposition. You're betting your whole regime. These sanctions are crippling. It is a bet the farm proposition. And one thing we always knew about Putin in the past, he never bet the farm. He was always a cautious guy, whether it was Syria or Georgia, whatever. He was not a guy who ever bet the farm. If he's betting the farm, that's a very frightening event.
Tell us why Germany is so important to the coalition against Putin.
I did a column a couple of years ago, I think, and the theme of it was that just as the Cold War was fought and won in Berlin, that is, who had Germany on their side, so the Cold War with China will be fought and won in Berlin. And what I meant was Germany is such a keystone to Europe and to the European Union that in the struggle between the US and China, and this is largely over standards and economics and trade issues, who has Germany on their side will actually determine the balance of power in that conflict. It is not only the most important manufacturing power there, it's the most important economic power. It's a serious, serious country. And taken seriously by fellow Europeans, they really set the tone for European economic policy. And they just have a new government, a left of center government led. And this is a real baptism of fire for them.
And their decision to come out first and suspend the Nord Stream 2 project might have been a surprise to Putin.
Absolutely. Just to fill people in, I mean, Putin's building a gas pipeline to, Putin gets Russia gets about 60% of their income from the export of oil and gas, and much of it to Central and Western Europe. Well, that gas pipeline actually now goes through Ukraine. And Ukraine derived a lot of income from taxing the transit, and they were building an alternative route directly to Germany. And if the Germans spurn that, that's a real problem. If that gets shut down, that's a real problem for Putin.
I want to quote you to you. No, in a nice way. We're all friends here.
That's right.
In a column about Kosovo in the year 2000, you quoted Karl Kraus. Karl Kraus, an Austrian journalist and playwright, who said, and I just think this is a very appropriate quotation today, European wars were caused by diplomats who lied to journalists and then believed what they read in the newspapers. I love that. Isn't that great? So,
I got to resurrect that.
It's a great. No, I think it's time for it to come back.
Thank you for reminding me.
It's a great.
Right, yeah.
So, do we think Putin believes his lies?
That's a very good question. And what is so frightening, again, is that you just have to step back, Tim, and say one thing. He's invading, his actions toward Ukraine, as I said the other day, is really the equivalent of like a village honor killing. Ukraine's like a wayward daughter or wife who fell in love with the European Union. And Putin is basically saying, if I can't have you, they're not going to have you either. I'm going to club you to death, and I'm going to drag you back home. There's something primitive and visceral about this. And we just haven't seen this kind of behavior truly since the German Anschluss, with Austria and Czechoslovakia. And that's what makes it so frightening. We thought that kind of behavior was in our past. And so what he believes, what he knows, is hard to know. It's impossible to know, but I guess what's ultimately so crazy about it, this is happening in the middle of a pandemic that is not over,
no.
that he has actually done very poorly in fortifying Russians to get through, and that may be part of this. So, as I said in my column the other day, when you're a journalist and these kind of events happen, the first thing you ask is like, boy, where should I be? Should I be in Kiev? Should I be in Moscow? Should I be in Munich? Should I be in Washington? I said, there's actually only one place you want to be, and that's in Putin's head. Because this war is entirely driven by him. And one of the things that is sort of, I should warn you, I should have said this at the beginning, I can ruin any dinner party. And I do weddings and bar mitzvahs, okay? So it's...
Are you saying don't invite you?
Right, it's just like, but what is a little scary as I look at the world today, Tim, is that Putin is the most powerful, unchecked leader of Russia since Stalin. Xi Jinping is the most powerful, unchecked leader of China since Mao. But there's one big difference. When Stalin was in power, he couldn't affect the US stock market. When Mao was in power, China was a completely isolated power. We're living in the middle of two extreme events. Two incredibly powerful but unchecked leaders leading two of the three powers in the world, but in a world where all the nodes are connected. And so that's a really frightening
But does that make us more vulnerable or them more vulnerable? Or are we equally vulnerable? Because because the flatter Earth it was very enlightened, right? Normally when someone is part of the Flat Earth Society, you don't consider them very enlightened. But it was an enlightened, but isn't there supposed to be a reciprocal vulnerability here?
And there is, except that our leader, to get back to the presidency, has to respond immediately in a way they don't. And so they may, get caught up in the pressure. If you think about kind of the world today, Tim, the world is incredibly fragile for this reason. We have wired the world together. It's flatter than ever. But we've also taken out all the buffers. And so now things go really quickly from one node to the whole system. So what you see over the last 20 years is we've had a succession of events that started with a warning heart attack and then went to the full coronary.
Yeah.
So 1997, 1993, World Trade Center, Ramzi Youssef tries to blow up the World Trade Center, doesn't succeed. Warning heart attack, 9/11, we get the full coronary. Maybe if people could turn off their cell phones, that'd be helpful. Unless it's for me.
Or it's a cyber attack.
That's right. So 1997, long-term capital management, small hedge fund, almost melts down world markets by amassing a couple $1 trillion in debt. 2008, the full heart attack. 2003, SARS-CoV-1 in Guangzhou. 2019, SARS-CoV-2. And what I really worry about is the next, warning heart attack will be climate change, for which there's actually no immunization. So what we're seeing is the world is more and more connected. We get events in far-off nodes, and the instability can be transmitted to the whole system much more quickly because we've greased the world. We've taken out all the buffers for economic reasons.
When assessing our president's actions in trying to create buffers, if you will, to what extent has President Biden been weighed down by the legacy of NATO enlargement? You wrote a very important piece yesterday that framed the issue. By the way, let's make clear, this is not a justification for bad behavior, but framed the issue by saying there is an issue here with the way in which, in the 90s, the United States conducted its foreign policy. So to what extent, first of all, does that weigh down Biden? But to what extent should he in some way operationalize his understanding that NATO enlargement may be one of the contributing factors to the world we live in today?
So now we dig deep into the history chest, 30 years ago. I became a columnist in January 1995, but from from 89 to 94, I was the New York Times diplomatic correspondent traveling with Jim Baker, Secretary Baker, and I traveled all 750,000 miles with him, and really had a front row seat to the end of the Cold War. So the Cold War ends, and immediately there's a push to expand NATO to the Eastern and Central European countries, and even former Russian satellites, beginning with Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. And this was driven by domestic constituencies here. There was a lot of pull from those countries. Russia, the Soviet Union's collapsed. Now is our time to get into NATO. There was a small group of people, policy makers and policy wonks. Sam Nunn, Senator Sam Nunn, George Kennan, the architect of containment, and Bill Perry, Secretary of Defense for President Clinton, and myself, Michael Mandelbaum, a few other people. And we basically said, wait a minute. We just had the moment we've been praying for. The Soviet Union collapsed, and it was actually pulled down by a democratic revolution. Rather than the first thing we do is expand NATO into their face, why don't we actually see if we can bring Russia into the West? This was our dream. And unfortunately, we were steamrolled. Both the domestic politics of it and the push from Eastern European voters here, and just sort of the kind of reflex from the Cold War, said, no, let's push NATO into their face. And when we asked the Russians, and Yeltsin, when he was sober, he said they got the feeling it was okay with them. Well, the fact was Russia was really weak at the time, and it was not okay. It was not okay at all, any more than it would be if Russia, if there was a left-wing government in Mexico and Russia said, we're going to expand the Warsaw Pact. But for Putin's first 8 years in office, 2000, 2004, 2004, 2008, Russia went through an incredible economic explosion, high oil prices and sort of the lifting, the weight off the economy. And so it didn't come up so much, and so they thought we could push more countries into NATO. And then economics in Russia started to stagnate. And we started to say, maybe not just Poland, Hungary, but Ukraine and Georgia too. And this was a big issue there for Putin and for others. And as Putin's popularity started to fall, he shifted his own sort of persona from the distributor of wealth to the protector of the motherland. Because he needed an emotive issue to sort of cover for his own economic failures and kleptocracy. And when he looked around for an emotive issue, what was there? Low-hanging fruit, but the fact that we had pushed NATO into Russia's face, and we're even talking about expanding it into Ukraine. And so, what is cause, what is effect here, Tim? It's hard to tell. Is Putin just exploiting this? Is this a real concern? I believe it is a real concern. And that's why on the day this all started, I wanted to remind people of this with a quote from George Kennan, the architect of America's containment policy. I called him at his home in 1998 in Princeton. He was 94 at the time, but boy, he was clearly focused on this. He said, this is a disaster. This is one of the dumbest things we could possibly do. He said, Russia is now weak, but when they are strong, they will push back on this, and when they do, all the NATO expanders will say, see, we told you, Russia's aggressive all the time.
Since you had a very close look at the George Herbert Walker Bush foreign policy administration, if you will. Wasn't that, in a sense, President Bush's understanding that you don't kick the Russians when they're down? Did you get a sense from Secretary of State Baker that they understood that they had to ease this empire out of business? Could you share with us what you recall?
Yeah, I mean, it was
then?
a remarkable, for me, journey. You know, I was a Middle East guy, and suddenly, you know, I got to see the end of the Cold War, and I was actually in the room in the Kremlin whenever you went to the Kremlin with the Secretary of State, there was a very stylized moment in one of the halls where the doors would fling, the press would be in the middle, the doors would fling open, Baker would walk out from one end, and Gorbachev would walk out, you know, the other. And then one day, the doors opened, and guess who's coming to dinner? And Boris Yeltsin walked out.
Oh.
And it was like, you knew that was a really, really important moment. And it was in December, and I remember we were in the Kremlin all day, and it was snowing, and they have a light on the Soviet flag. It was still flying over there. And I thought to myself as I saw that, I wonder if this is the last time that flag will fly here. But one thing I admired, I think George H.W. Bush, Secretary Jim Baker, Brent Scowcroft, Dick Cheney, who was then also Secretary of Defense, they were an awesome team. And they were a team. And what I admired about them, one of the things I learned in the Middle East, Tim, I don't know if you ever saw the movie There Will Be Blood, but the final scene there, where the oil man basically explains to the preacher why he's stolen all his oil. And he says, Eli, my man, it's like a milkshake, you know. I have a straw, and you have a straw. And my straw, I drank your milkshake. And one of my rules of life, Tim, is never drink all of the other guys' milkshake. Always leave them something for their face. You know, 5 years ago, you may know, I actually changed my business card. I used to say Thomas L. Friedman, Foreign Affairs columnist, New York Times. I changed it to Thomas L. Friedman, New York Times humiliation and dignity columnist. That's true. Because the biggest thing I learned, if you said I've been writing a column since '95, the biggest thing I've learned is that the two most powerful human emotions are humiliation and dignity. And I basically spent my career covering people acting out on their humiliation. China after a century of humiliation, Putin after NATO expansion, Palestinians versus Israelis, Muslim youth in Europe, you know, versus the Christian majority. All I do basically is covering people acting out on their humiliation and questing for dignity. And it's why for me, the biggest lesson when young people come to me and say, I want to be a journalist, you know, I want to be a columnist, what do I need to know? I tell them, look, it's really good if you can type fast. I can really type fast. You want to know some history, politics, economics. But there's a couple things you really need.
Oops, we have the same business again. There we go. It stopped. No?
First of all, you have to like people. So I really like people. And when you like people, they like you back in the sense they share with you their crazy hopes, dreams, you know, the nutty things they do. And if you can't hear the music, you'll never be able to play the music. But the second thing is you have to be a good listener. And it's for two reasons. First is what you learn when you listen. All the stories I got wrong were because I was talking when I should have been listening. But much more important is what you say when you listen, which is the title of my next book. What you say when you listen, because listening is a sign of respect. And it's amazing what people will let you say to them if they think you respect them. If they don't think you respect them, you can't tell them the sky is blue. You know, I'm a little Jewish guy from Minnesota who wanted to cover the Arab Muslim world in the 70s. That was not a natural thing, okay? And so first of all, I had to persuade UPI and then the New York Times to send me to Beirut, the first Jewish person they sent to Beirut for the New York Times, and then to Jerusalem. I was the first Jewish person they sent to Israel. And as if you followed my coverage, you know, my coverage is not, you're all great, you're all wonderful, it's all the Yehudis' fault. You know, I mean, I'm in people's face a lot. But there's one thing they know, I respect them. I respect them, and I'm not here to put you down. I'm actually here because I really love this place, this region, this culture, and I want to see you realize your full potential. And therefore, sometimes I can go into a room and group of young Arab students, they got some columns, I'm there, they're ready to carve me up. But if you spend an hour listening to people, and I mean deep listening, not just waiting for them to stop talking, by the end of that hour, they're not only listening to you, but they want to get a picture with you on their cell phone. And that's my goal always. I don't compromise myself, but I will listen to you, and I will take it seriously. I had a very funny exchange a couple of weeks ago with Bob Wright, who writes a wonderful blog called Non-Zero, and Bob's someone I really respect, intellectual. And he called me up after I did a column headlined, "Putin to Ukraine, marry me or I'll kill you." And it was kind of how I saw the dynamics. And Bob called me up, he said, but you said Putin's up a tree and that you wouldn't help him down the tree, and I thought that was too hard line, and I'm really angry about your column. And so I said, you are so annoying. You just really annoy me, but in a good way, because I respect him. So we talked it out, and he said, would you do my podcast? So we did a podcast a few days later, and we both sort of went back and forth on our positions. And he sent me all these emails he got from people that said, wow, it was so great to hear a civil discussion, debate, argument with two people who weren't just trying to outsmart aleck each other, And I think there's so many people in the country are hungry for that. It's well known, I never look at Twitter. I never look at Facebook. I use Twitter to broadcast my column. That's basically it. Because it's just a giant smart aleck machine, a competition, I find. And when I see the stuff, and it just really inhibits civilized debate and discussion.
Beyond listening, what tip would you give to young journalism students today who want to follow in your footsteps?
Well, one of the things I do in this book I'm writing is explain to people how I learn, because everybody learns differently, And I had a way of learning that evolved over my career. I wish I could say I knew this at the beginning, this is how I shall learn and whatnot, but it wasn't. But this is all looking back retrospectively how I learned. And I learned by going to the outer edge of three different realms. Mm-hmm. The first was to the outer edge of human behavior. I lived in a civil war in Beirut for almost 5 years. And when you live inside a civil war, you get to see how molecules behave at very high temperatures. You get to see what human beings are capable of for good and ill, mm-hmm. in a way you're never going to see that, in Boca Raton or Minneapolis for that matter. I saw some crazy stuff. I covered the Sovereign Shatila massacre. I covered the U.S. Embassy bombing. I covered the Marine bombing. I covered the Hama massacre. I saw my own apartment was blown up. My driver's wife and 2 daughters were killed in my apartment. I saw just the worst, but also some of the best of human behavior. And what that taught me, Tim, was to be an anthropologist. Because in Beirut, there was no data. The only data was talking to another human being. In fact, I'm slightly embarrassed to tell this story, but I told it in Beirut to Jerusalem. When I first came to Beirut, I was working for UPI, the wire service, and every night we had to file the weather highlights from Beirut for the worldwide weather highlights. This is before you had all that on your phone, So the next day's paper, Beirut high, whatever. And there was no weatherman in Beirut. And so I used to make up the weather report every day. Oh. And I would say, Ahmed, how does it feel out there? Yeah, it's 75. Yeah, Mr. Tom, 75. Tonight, it's 63. Yeah, Mr. Tom. And thus was the weather.
It's like Ronald Reagan with the football games that he used to cover.
Right. So, but the point was, it really got me to develop an ear for quotes and for people's voice, and to listen to people and learn from people. Second, I went to the outer realm of technology. So I developed this habit of, and I was the foreign affairs columnist, but I would go to companies, the cutting-edge companies, the Amazons, the Microsofts, the Infosys in India, and I would say, don't care about your stock price, don't care about your quarterly earnings, don't care about your next CEO, just want to do 2 things. Want to hang out in your research lab and your HR department. Because whatever's going on in research at the tip of the spear, if you want to know the future, hang around with the people who are inventing it, at a place like Infosys, India's Microsoft, and then how they're training their people for the tip they're inventing struck me as something that was going to come to a neighborhood near me. So that's how I wrote The World is Flat. I went to Bangalore, India, go to Infosys, hung out in their research department, but then was doing the leading work on outsourcing, hung out in their HR department. And then one day, at the end of it, I sat with their CEO, Nanda Nilekani, at a couch outside his office. And they got a plaque there now. And I had my laptop on my lap. And he said, Tom, I got to tell you, the global economic playing field is being leveled. And you Americans aren't ready. Oh, I wrote that down on my laptop. The global economic playing field will be leveled, and you Americans are not ready. We got done with the interview. I got back in my Jeep to drive back from Bangalore to Electronic City to Bangalore, my hotel. And all the way, Tim, I'm rolling over in my head, the global economic playing field is being leveled. He's actually telling me it's being flattened. Oh, he just told me the world is flat. And I wrote that down in my notebook, the world is flat. I got back to the Leela Palace. I ran up to my room. I called my wife in Bethesda. I said, honey, I'm going to write a book called The World is Flat. She now says she thought that was a great idea. Okay. That's not exactly how I remember the conversation going. But I was so excited about the idea, I actually outlined it on the back of an envelope. And it was Nandan's birthday that night. He invited me over, and he was so excited. He asked me to give a talk about it at his birthday party. Okay, and I literally got home. I called my bosses. I said, I need to go on leave immediately. My software is out of date. I'm a basic engineer, and it's a Java world. And if you don't give me a leave, I'm going to write something really stupid in the New York Times. And I went on leave 3 months later, and I wrote the book in 6 months. It was just like that. But I never would have, had I not gone to the edge, I wouldn't have done that. Now, one good thing about the edge is you get to name things. Like when you're on the edge of something, you're the first one there. You can say the world is flat.
And anyways, it's more fun. It's exciting.
It's tremendous exciting. And the third thing I did, as readers know, is I spent the last 25 years traveling the world with Conservation International to every pristine ecosystem in the world. The U.S. Navy took me on their ice exercise underneath the Arctic in a submarine. And I learned how natural systems work. And I wrote a book called Hot, Flat, and Crowded about it. And part of what I came to understand was, wow, this globalization thing I've been writing about is so complex. There's only one thing that mirrors it in its complexity, and that's natural systems. So if you study natural systems, you might get great insight into how globalization works and how globalization gets translated. And so then what I do in my journalism is I'm always arbitraging all three of those together. So I got my master's degree in Arabic and Middle East Studies from St. Antony's College, Oxford. I had a classic British Arabist education. Graduated in 1978. If you could take that Tom Friedman of 1978 and you plunk him here today and you say, hey, Tom, what just happened in Syria? That Tom Friedman would say, Tim, they just had a coup. It's like when they overthrew Adib Shishakli in 58. I would have been very one-dimensional view. You ask this Tom Friedman, he'll tell you Syria suffered its most serious drought between 2006 and 2010 in its modern history. 1 million Syrian farmers and herders left their home, flocked to the cities, overwhelmed the infrastructure. Assad did nothing for them. Then they got on these things, these are called cell phones. They watched the revolution in Tunisia and Cairo, and then they blew the lid off the place. It was the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law all coming together. And if you don't arbitrage those three, you'll never see the story.
Your books sell, as they should, brilliantly. To what extent do you think they have shaped, or maybe put it this way, how would you grade our presidents and their advisors' ability to function in a flatter world with Moore's Law?
It's hard to, there's sort of two ways of looking at that question. As a presidential scholar, I'm actually interested in your view, because there's those who understand it conceptually, and then there's the implementation, and that's really hard.
Yeah.
So, of all the people, President Obama probably was the one who internalized, conceptually understood what I was saying. But there's things that each of these presidents did in my lifetime that were sort of gut reactions that had nothing to do with the theory, and some were really good and some were really bad. So there's always going to be a tension, it seems to me, between a kind of academic view of the world and then balancing the politics, the economics, and what's actually going on out in the world. I think this is a hellish time to be president.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, it's a hellish time to run anything. But to be president of the United States now, when I was traveling with Jim Baker, To be Secretary of State was to manage strength. Our strength, the strength of our allies, and the strength of some of our adversaries. Being Secretary of State and President today is all about managing weakness. The weakness of our opponents, the weakness of the United States, and managing weakness, Tim, is hell on wheels. And so I have a great sympathy for anyone who has to do that.
Do you think that President Biden could have increased his soft power as a result of the insurrection, January 6th, that happened before he became president, and the pandemic, in a way that he hasn't? Because it's really striking for this presidential analyst that we've had simultaneous crises.
Yeah.
And normally our country unifies in crises. And these have managed to push us further apart. And I was wondering, as someone because you think a lot about soft power, you write a lot about it, what could President Biden perhaps have done to increase his soft power at this moment of simultaneous crises?
That's a really, really powerful question. Look, I think we are going through a foundational transition in the country. So I think of three of our founding sort of principles. We the people. The preamble to the Constitution. We the people. That's how it begins. On our dollar bill, it says, out of many, one. And the end of the preamble of the Constitution is, in pursuit of a more perfect union. So let's take those three phases. What we are in the middle of today is we are relitigating who is the we in we the people. And that's the biggest thing going on in the country. Are we the people, the descendants of the original pilgrims, or are we the people, this incredibly diverse new amalgam? And we're in the middle of relitigating that. And the only way to relitigate it in a stable way is to redefine our motto as out of very many, one. It's not just out of many now. It's out of very many. And because we are in the middle of that and aren't doing a great job of doing it in a stable way, we are actually pausing our actual project, which is to make a more perfect union. And that's kind of how I see our politics right now. We're relitigating this because it's got to be out of many more, we make one. And because we can't get from here to there, our project of making a more perfect union is now on hold.
But we have no choice, in a sense, because we can put it on hold for not very long.
Well, and it's what concerns me, and I think that we're starting to see, and I'm not going to get deep into politics here, but we're starting to see, if you look at what happened in the San Francisco and Minneapolis votes that were really repudiations of some far-left positions, if you see some stuff going on in the Republican Party now, I think there's at least some movement, to repudiate some far-right positions. There is a center-left and center-right. I still believe this is a center-left, center-right country. And that's why I wrote a very controversial column a few weeks ago called Biden-Cheney 2024.
Yes.
Which did get...
Not Dick Cheney.
Yeah, no. Which
that
did
would
get
be the Young People's
that's right,
Coalition, right?
That did get a few letters to the editor. The point I was making was that a country whose politics I follow very closely, Israel, had determined that after 4 elections in 2 years, unable to produce a prime minister, basically the center-right and the left and an Arab Islamist leader came together to form a party to evict Benjamin Netanyahu because they thought the stability of their political system wouldn't survive after 4 elections unless they did that. The center came together there, but they have a parliamentary system that makes that easy.
Yeah.
I think that there's a will to do that here, but our system, third parties are really difficult. I don't see how we're going to stabilize things just going back and forth. You know, among the other controversial quotes that you didn't elicit from me is one where I wrote a couple of years ago that there's only one thing worse, Tim, than one-party autocracy. And that's what we have, one-party democracy, where one party's in power and the other tries to put a wrench into everything it does. So a one-party autocracy like China, if it has a reasonably enlightened leadership, which really pissed a lot of people off when I said that, which I simply means they believe in physics, you know, and things like that, it can actually order a lot of things from the top down. In fact, it can order the fact that it actually takes 19 hours, I think, and 21 minutes to take our bullet train from New York to Chicago. And it takes 4 hours and 30 minutes, basically, to take the bullet train from Shanghai to Beijing, and it's a longer distance. So, you know, when you aren't doing those sort of basic infrastructure things year in and year out, because one party is trying to stick a wrench in the other, and you can't think strategically about what the country needs, you start to really fall behind. And I don't think we can go on like this indefinitely. There's too many unmet needs.
Do you see a way that a foreign crisis could actually pull us together again?
Well, I think the scariest thing, you know, in our politics right now is that if a pandemic that's killed almost 1 million of our fellow citizens and threatens every single person, if that couldn't do it, I don't look for an external one to do it. Look, I've just read the story coming over here. Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump are on Russian television, you know, being featured on Russian television for some statements they made, and that's you know, that doesn't bespeak a lot of unity coming together around this.
Might be worthwhile to share, since we're talking about presidents and foreign policy, what you saw of the, if you could say, bipartisan, the bipartisan foundations of U.S. foreign policy in those years when you started out. What was bipartisanship in U.S. foreign policy, as you remember it?
Well, I go back to Minnesota. You know, I mean, and let me just talk about, you know, my roots. I grew up in, you know, what you could actually, maybe one day someone will write a biography of me. That's really, I don't mean this, and if they do, they should call it Always Looking for Minnesota. Because that's basically the reason I'm so messed up as a columnist and an inveterate sort of optimist.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
What do you mean messed up?
I mean that you know, I was once in Israel, and the Haaretz newspaper runs my column in Hebrew. Okay. And I was having dinner with the editor, and there was an Israeli general there, and I said to the editor at the time, I said, "Why do you run my column? Because I get a big kick out of that, you know? It runs in Hebrew." He said, "Tom, you're the only optimist we have." And there was an Israeli general, Uri Dayan. He said, "Tom, I know why you're an optimist." I said, "Why?" It's because you're short. I said, "I'm short. I'm not that." He said, "You can only see the part of the glass that's half full." Okay?
Oh, that's great. So, that's great.
So, you know, you know, so I grew up in a really freaky place and time. I wrote about it in my last book. Thank you for being late.
I'm just testing it out.
So my parents were born in Minnesota, and they grew up in the north side of Minneapolis. I was born about 3 miles from where George Floyd was killed. Because the north side of Minneapolis, when I grew up in the 30s and 40s, when my parents grew up in the 30s, 40s, 50s, was basically a ghetto of blacks and Jews. And Minneapolis was the capital of anti-Semitism in the United States. My parents couldn't join AAA, you know, when I was born. And after the war, basically the Jews were able to get out of the ghetto. The African-American community couldn't, too many restrictions. And in Minneapolis, they all moved to one suburb, basically, called St. Louis Park. And a migration, and this was, so a suburb that had been like 100% white, Protestant, Catholic, Scandinavian, and German, overnight, basically, over a pace of 3 years, became 20% Jewish, 80% white, Protestant, Catholic, Scandinavian. If Sweden and Israel had a baby, it would have been St. Louis Park, okay? So, as I relate in the book, so I grew up in the same town at the same time with the Coen brothers, the filmmakers, Al Franken, Norm Ornstein, the political scientist, Michael Sandel, the political theorist, Peggy Ornstein, the writer, Sharon Isbin, the guitarist. We all
There was something special in the water, right?
There was just, the Coen brothers they once introduced me at an event for late Vice President Mondale, and they compared it to this town in Transylvania where all these Draculas came from. And But their movie, A Serious Man, was about our town. So I grew up in I actually saw pluralism work. It was not the pluralism of white and black, but it was a religious pluralism. And we had only one African American or two in our high school. It was not that kind of pluralism, but it was a pluralism of really different cultures. And there was then a lot of Minnesota nice. It covered for a lot of racism, actually. But there was, if you grew up and you were on the right side of that, you did experience a certain optimism that things could work, And I've told the story, my friend, when I was working on my last book, my friend Jay Goldberg called me one day and he said, my wife Eileen was driving on the highway and she came home, she said, Jay, I was almost driven off the road today. I was so mad I almost honked.
Wow.
That's road rage in Minnesota, back then, In fact, my dad there was a Jewish mafia in Minnesota, and my dad had a lot of friends in it, and when I was 5 or 6 years old, my dad came home one day and told me that one of his friends had been sentenced to prison.
Oh.
And I said, wow, my dad knows someone who went to jail. He said, Dad, what did he do? He said, well, son, he was shopping in a store before it was open. That's
a nice way of putting it,
Minnesota,
right? Sort of.
That was back then Minnesota for breaking and entering. So that was the environment I grew up in. It's a very different Minnesota today, and we can talk about that and why. But I grew up in that environment. And so most of all, my mom was a radical liberal. And she voted for 12 elections in a row for Bill Frenzel, our congressman, who was a moderate Republican who would run every 2 years, and his only advertising sign was Frenzel for Congress over Highway 100, and it never said what party he was from.
You have an incredible description of Fort Lewis, right? It's Park Lewis, but St. Louis Park. St. Louis Park. And you talk about, yes, the community, this is beautiful, but you also talk about the courage of civic leaders.
Yes.
So that's part of the recipe too, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I saw that. I mean, Vice President Mondale was one of my dearest friends. And the leaders of Minnesota back then, there was a huge amount of compromise between Republicans and Democrats. And obviously it was, a different, culturally, it was a much more homogenous place. I get all that. But what you see today is, and again, this I think is the perverse nature of social networks. Everyone's looking over their shoulder at what's said about them. I have to tell you, I have so many colleagues who will say to me, I went out and covered this thing, and then I come home, I get ravaged on Twitter. And I want to tell them, and I do tell them, I really believe that Dave Chappelle had it right when he said, Twitter, it's not a real place, okay? And it's a very distorting environment. And if you let that be your proxy of the world, it will drive you crazy.
But it takes a certain courage, doesn't it, to write a column every couple of days when you don't know the way things are going to turn out, because that column will be forever.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Well, part of it is that's your job. That's what you got to do, and you're not going to get them all right. I got plenty of things wrong, and my critics will remind me of that every day. But I have to tell you, there's just an incredible, like that NATO column, NATO expansion column.
Yeah.
I just woke up in the morning, and it just wrote itself. And it is such a high, Tim, to wake up in the morning. And I wake up in the middle of the night a lot, and I get ideas, and I actually take out my phone and I write them down. This is where I get a lot of my ideas. And you have an idea, and you go and write it, and in 12 hours, it's shared with the whole world. And it's such a privilege to do that on the New York Times platform. I take it so seriously. A lot of people will say, boy, you're really influential. I do not, after I write a column, go into the bathroom, into the mirror and say, influential. It's just the opposite. I sit there, did I get this right? I call my wife is my editor, but I call my friends, my intellectual friends, did I get that right? Did I get that right? I'm so worried that I would get something wrong in the New York Times. And I have such respect for that platform. So, but it's an incredible high when you do it and you feel you nailed it and you help people think about something in a new way.
Tell us if you're willing to share, where you've helped people with power think about something in a new way.
Well, I mean, the introducer was very nice to say that I advise, but I actually don't advise anybody. I've had a chance to have one-on-ones with, every president since George H.W. And I used to talk to Trump occasionally. He would call me. In fact, after the Abraham Accords were signed, I was playing in a golf tournament. And I was on the first hole. I was on in 2, and my phone rang, and I could see it was it was White House, and it was President Trump, and he said, "Tom," because I wrote a very laudatory column about the Abraham Accords and what he had done, and he said, "I can't believe the New York Times lets you write that." And I said, I actually knew the president, so I said, Mr. President, I can write whatever I want, And I wrote it because I thought it was right. And then he talked for 25 minutes about something else. But I think that your credibility depends on, you got to call balls and strikes. My NATO column, that was kind of a strike against Democrats, basically, and a challenge for President Biden because he was part of that group. But that's where, one of the things you learn as a journalist is that your power doesn't actually come from writing nice things about people. Your power comes from if people, journalists will sometimes, especially in the Middle East, will say, both sides are criticizing me, I must be doing something right. That's about the dumbest thing you can say, in my view. It takes no skill to alienate both sides, I can tell you that. What I aspire to, Tim, is I want both sides to take me seriously. That's what I aspire to. And, I did with King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi peace plan. It was through my column that it was introduced to the world. And I'd been writing really critically about Saudi Arabia after 9/11. And, but in the end, when they wanted to put that out, they didn't choose one of their, trained SEALs. Yeah. They knew your currency is your credibility. And I guard that zealously. And if you lose that, you lose everything as a columnist. And so, I've been screamed at by presidents. Can
you tell us about one president who's a good? Which?
I think I interviewed President Obama the day the Iran deal was announced. It was very, very strange thing. I actually broke my shoulder on a hike. Oh. And I have an artificial shoulder now. And I was home, and I was still on, frankly, opioids of pain.
Friendly opioids.
Yeah, and I got a call from the White House at 3 in the morning that they just signed the Iran deal. President Obama expects you in the Oval Office at 11. He wants to give an interview on the Iran deal.
Okay.
So I called my daughter, Natalie, who is now the executive producer of All Things Considered Weekend on National Public Radio. I said, Natty, I need you to literally carry my notepad. And we went to the Oval Office, and we also filmed it for the New York Times. And if you actually watch the film, I'm like here, And I was so high. There were like 3 of him, talking to me. And we did the interview, and there's a little walkway, between the Oval and the outer area. And in that, as we walked through there, let me say that President Obama suggested in the strongest possible language that he would appreciate it if I would endorse this deal. So you'll get lobbied like that. It might have been a little more vociferous than that, but I was so high, I didn't know what was going on.
Did President Clinton ever lobby you?
You know, President Clinton, because I had a lot of interaction with him, because I was the White House correspondent then. And see if I can recreate this, you know. President Clinton was a remarkable person to interact with because he was full of all his faults we all know, but he was really interesting. And he once called me and asked me to play golf. And I played golf with him with 2 other people. And afterwards, I sent him, as a thank you, I sent him a book on golf strategy. And
Did President Clinton count all of his strokes?
It's pretty well known that the answer is no. You know, it's
Barbara Bush made a point of telling me that he'd cheat.
So
I don't know why she made that point, but she was,
anyways, about a week later, I got a picture of the 2 of us on the golf course from him, signed by the president. And it said, thanks for the book on golf strategy, Tom. I admire your game. How did he put it? It was like, I'm continuing to focus on mine. I'm hitting it farther and straighter, but still not scoring. I wonder if there's a parallel with my presidency.
ooh.
And I have that on my wall. That picture with that sign. Yeah, it was such a honest and interesting reflection.
Was this the first term or second term?
First term, yeah. It was actually written the day his lawyer was killed. He committed suicide. Yeah, and so sometimes you'll get a glimpse like that, you know, and that was one I saved, you know, because he was capable of that kind of really deep insight, you know. Traveling with Jim Baker for 4 years, I mean, I got screamed at a lot, and but I have huge respect for Jim. He was an amazing statesman, and what he taught me, Tim, something you wrestle with. I got to watch people exercise American power, you know, and it's an awesome thing. It was an awesome thing, and when Baker showed up, you know, people sat up a little straighter, you know. Because they sensed 2 things. One, that he was a powerful character, but they understood that he and George W. Bush were like that. Mm-hmm. So if you were talking to Baker, you were talking to Bush. He once screamed at me in Damascus. I remember the scene in a hotel room there, because I'd written a column suggesting a divergence between the 2. And we landed in Damascus. Margaret Tutwiler called, "Secretary wants to see you in his suite." Immediately we landed. But that's a good developmental thing, like being shouted at by these guys and not backing down, you know, too. So that's part of learning. You know, we hit each other with our purses, but I had a lot of respect for him.
Are there any insights you could give us into our current president from your interactions with President Biden when he was vice president or?
Well, I had a very interesting experience with President Biden because in 2001, a week after Kabul fell, I got a call from the then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one Senator Joe Biden, and would I like to go with him to Afghanistan? And so then Senator Biden, myself, and 2 of his aides, we spent 2 weeks in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I actually wrote about it when the Afghan withdrawal happened, because we both shared a similar sentiment. And the sentiment was, I wrote a column from there on that trip after being actually in Peshawar in Pakistan. And the column was called American Express Not Accepted Here. And my view was, as I wrote in that column, we should do our business as best we can and go home and only come back when we can build schools.
And that was, at the time, Senator Biden's view as well.
That's why none of this surprised me all along. So that was interesting. And spending 2 weeks with him, I really got to know him quite well. So he's only given 2 one-on-one interviews since he's been president. One was with me during the transition.
And can you give us some insight into Secretary of State Blinken?
Baker I think his great strength was that he did come from the world of politics. So I was with Baker when I was the pool reporter when Edvard Shevardnadze, the first sort of foreign minister of the new Russia, came to the United States, and Baker took him to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And I was the pool reporter on the private small plane they went out there with. And I wrote about this because I could hear Baker telling him, now this is what you do. You do all the hard stuff up front and blame it on your predecessors. And that was a politician, talking to a new Secretary of State. And so he had a very good feel for, that kind of thing. But they did something so amazing. They helped bring the Soviet Union in for a soft landing with the great help of Gorbachev. And they reunified Germany. People don't appreciate it. That was an amazing achievement. Over the opposition of the French weren't excited about it. Margaret Thatcher wasn't excited about it. And I was actually in the room in the Kremlin when they signed the reunification of Germany. We were the 12 traveling reporters with Baker, and then the 6 foreign secretaries: United States, Britain, Russia, East Germany, West Germany, and so they were up there, and we were given as reporters mimeographed copies of the treaty, reunifying Germany. And I don't know what possessed me to do this, Tim, but I stood next to the stage when they all got done, and I asked each of them to sign my copy. So I actually have the only other signed copy of the treaty unifying Germany.
That's brilliant.
And so, I don't know, is that an NFT? Does that qualify?
No, don't do that. No. Now, you can't go from not doing Twitter to suddenly engaging in NFTs. What about another Secretary of State whose name begins with a B? What about Blinken? What do you know about our current Secretary?
Well, I know Tony from obviously he was Deputy Secretary, National Security Advisor, World of Foreign Policy, and very, very thoughtful guy, knows kind of all the contours. I think they really messed up Afghanistan, the withdrawal. And he will bear a lot of the brunt of the studies of why that went. The State Department really failed to prepare its people to get out of Afghanistan in a way that the Pentagon didn't. And I think what you're seeing now and how they're dealing with this crisis is the benefit of what they learned there.
A little bit of a Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis
exactly.
kind of relationship.
And so really on top of, and this plays to their strength, working with our NATO allies, people they know, and having this really now intimate relationship, regular. We're seeing the resurgence of the whole Atlantic Alliance. Will it hold? I don't know. But I think this moment is their moment of recovery.
I was fortunate enough to receive some questions from students at FAU, and I want to ask those questions before this remarkable session comes to an end. One of them was about the role of climate change in seeking a Middle East peace agreement. Could you mentioned Syria and the drought. Could you pull those two threads together for us, please?
Sure. This is something I've written about a lot and have great interest in, and just wrote about it recently. So I'll back up and start at sort of 30,000 feet, Tim. It's a wonderful question. It's January 3rd, 2020. Mm-hmm. I'm on vacation in New Zealand. And my phone rings, and it's my editor, and he says, the Trump administration just assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the Revolutionary Guards. We need you to write a column about it. I said, guys, I'm in New Zealand, okay? It's a long way from Iran. I'm on vacation. I'm playing golf. Leave me alone. Please leave me alone. But being myself, I immediately stewed over the whole thing. I went to bed. I got up the next morning. I took out my laptop. And this happens sometimes where there's sort of an out-of-body moment where you're over here and you're actually watching your fingers. I wonder what they'll type. And my fingers typed, the Trump administration just assassinated the dumbest man in Iran. And I looked at that and I said, wow.
My fingers did that?
Where did that come from? Okay. And where it came from was I was saying to and about Soleimani, you know what? I'm actually not going to judge you on the old axis, how much you resisted us. We resisted you, you resisted us, you resist Israel, you're the Saudis, whatever. Actually, no, I'm actually going to judge you on your performance in the context within which your country is living. Now let's look at that context. Lake Urmia, the biggest lake in the Middle East, is basically almost dried up in northwestern Iran. Giant lake. You have water riots. You had to kill people in the south of Iran over water riots in the provinces there. And what was your business model? By the way, your population has gone from 40 million in 1979 to 85 million. And what was your business model in this context? It was to hire Arab Shiites to kill Arab Sunnis in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. I think you're the dumbest man in Iran. Because I think a new generation of leaders is emerging in the Middle East that are saying to their people, don't judge me on my resistance, judge me on my resilience. Am I producing and generating resilience for my people in the context of a drought-driven, hotter, more unstable world? And I think this is the new divide in the Middle East between the resistance leaders and the resilience leaders. Now, we just saw a fascinating moment. You could be forgiven for having missed this. The United Arab Emirates, Israel, and Jordan signed a deal for UAE to build solar farms in Jordan, to provide cheap electricity for Israel to desalinate water, to give a water-starved Jordan. Wonderful deal, perfect kind of collaboration. They were they were at the signing ceremony. John Kerry was there. They're literally, you sign here, and the phone rings. Who is it? MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Talks to MBZ, the leader of UAE. Don't sign that deal. Don't sign that deal. I'm your big neighbor. Don't sign that deal. Why not? Because I want to do that deal. I want to be seen as Mr. Green in the Middle East. So they actually have to reduce the deal to a memorandum of understanding. Because that's a leader who's saying, I don't want to build my authority anymore on resistance. I got in enough trouble for that. I want to be seen as a resilience leader. And I think this divide, you're going to see it more and more of the new generation who are going to say, judge me on whether I generated resilience for my country, for my people, in a climate-driven world, climate-change-driven world, not resistance. And Putin is old. You know, when Biden gave his press conference a couple weeks ago, I was out doing my just sort of usual walk. I said, I want to listen to this, you know, on my headphones. So I just listening to the president, you know, and there was just a little half line. He went by so fast. And I wrote my whole column about it. And he says, he's talking about Putin, you need to do this. He says, by the way, Vladimir, your tundra is melting. And you're worried about Ukraine. It was just a half line, went by so fast. And I went back home, I wrote my whole column of Biden's speech. I said, you all missed the most important line. Because he was basically saying to Putin the same thing. You want to be a resistance leader? Well, your tundra just had a fire in the middle of February that the fire department out there had to stamp out with their feet, a forest fire, because all the water pipes were frozen. Now you're doing that. That's happening there while you're trying to take over Ukraine. And so I think we're going to see these more. I think we're at the beginning, Tim. And for you, it'll be very interesting of you, how you judge presidents and leaders. Are you a resilience leader or are you a resistance leader?
And I think there's certainly a generational desire for presidents to be activists. It's very interesting when you talk to students, their interest in old-fashioned, if you will, state foreign affairs, or state against state foreign affairs is not that strong. But when you talk about racial justice, humanitarian assistance, LGBTQ rights around the world, there is a sense that those who have should help those who don't. But there's a tension there, isn't there? When the United States uses its authority to tell other countries to help minorities in other countries. So I was wondering how you think we should balance what is a clear desire, certainly not just among young people, come on, but it is more and more prevalent among young people for us to use our voice to help those that don't have a voice. And old-fashioned realpolitik.
Yeah. Well, I think we're in a my hope is we're in a transition. And my and your generation, maybe we're the transition generation. So let me explain what I mean. My dad, sister, and brother-in-law came back from the war in 1949 and decided to move from Minneapolis to Wilmer, Minnesota, town in west central Minnesota, biggest town there, to start a little steel company. And at the time, Wilmer was 99.99999% white, Protestant, Catholic, Scandinavian, German, and 3 Jewish families, one of whom was my aunt and uncle. They were the diversity in town at the time, okay? And for 50 years, I visited Wilmer, Minnesota. So I became an expert on Wilmer, Minnesota. Around 1975, I remember my aunt coming to a family event in Minneapolis, and she pulled me aside and said, Tom, I was in the grocery store on Saturday, and I heard someone speaking Spanish. Spanish. And it was her first encounter with the other. And she never forgot it, and I didn't either, this moment where she said this to me. So my aunt and uncle died about 10 years ago, and 4 years ago now, right before the pandemic, I got a call from a woman named Dana Mortensen, who runs a wonderful education NGO called World Savvy. And she said, would I give a lecture for her? And I said, well, where are you working? She said, we're working in Wilmer. Wilmer? I'm an expert on Wilmer. I want to know what's going on there. So I said, I'll make you a deal. I'll give you a free lecture. You give me a tour of Wilmer, okay? She said, deal. So I called my closest Israeli friend, a guy named Giddy Greenstein, who's an expert on small towns in Israel. I said, Giddy, have you ever been to west central Minnesota? He said, no, we're going. She called Hamza Warfa, the leading Somali in the state of Minnesota government, and said, Hamza, come with us. So the 4 of us get in a minivan. This was like the answer to a joke. You know, so an Israeli, a Somali, a New York Times, all go to a bar in Wilmer. And our first stop is Wilmer High School. And the principal meets us. And he shows us there's a giant steel map over the lobby, a world map, and he explains that the rising seniors take out a ladder every year and put pins in that map of all the places where the senior class at Wilmer High are from, because Wilmer today is 50% Somali and Latino.
Wow.
A town that in 1949 was what it was. In 75, my aunt heard someone speaking Spanish. Now that's how rapid the change is. So the reason I'm telling you the story is that we were there, and we were standing in the lobby at breakfast time, and the students were coming through a breakfast snack, and so it's like a Benetton ad, you know what I mean, just the diversity of the class. So I pulled the principal aside. I said, do you have to do a diversity class here? He said, yeah, we tried that one day. The student said, get lost, because Juan is dating Zhao. Zhao is, best friends with Ahmed. I mean, for them, this is natural. This is their Wilmer. And my hope is that as that generation that grows up with this, that is normalized by it, that is totally mixing together, that we are the transition between what was in 49 to what will be in 2050. That's my hope. A long way of answering your question.
So, with this last question, you wrote you wrote many wonderful columns. There was one particularly important column for a historian, at least, where we were leaving Afghanistan, and you said, we've made this mistake, and wouldn't it be wonderful if 20 years ahead of time we could think about the mistake before it happens and not make it? And then it was a column about China. And what I wanted to ask you was, as all of us think about China, what are the elements that you want us to think about so our leaders don't because of our pressure, don't make a 20-year mistake today?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and you know, I'm really depressed about China. I'll tell you honestly. So I've been visiting China every year since 1989, except the last two, obviously. And China today, Tim, is so much more open than it was 40 years ago, and so much more closed than it was 5 years ago. It's gone on a U-turn under Xi Jinping, and I'm just very, very worried about that because, you know, basically, I think we will look back. The years 1979 to 2019 were an epic in U.S.-China relations. I call it the epic of unconscious integration. FAU could wake up and say, we'd like to have a campus in Shenzhen, you know. They could have a campus there. A Florida company could say, I want a supply chain. We have a supply chain. I want to hire Chinese scientists. Chinese could say, I want to be listed on the NASDAQ. I want to have a factory in Ohio or Tallahassee. It was unconscious integration, and during those 40 years, we became the real one country, two systems, not China, Hong Kong. We were the real one country, two systems. Now, during those 40 years, we sold China sold us shallow goods, what I call shallow goods. Goods you wear on your foot, or your clothes on your back, or solar panels you affix to your roof. They weren't very deep things. We sold China deep goods, software and computers and machines, because they couldn't make deep goods. And as long as we sold China deep goods and they only sold us shallow goods, it all worked. And then suddenly, in the last 8-10 years, they could suddenly make deep goods, Huawei 5G. And they came and they said, hey, Mayor of Miami, we want to wire Miami. And we said, wait a minute. You want us to buy your deep goods? When you just sold us shallow goods, we didn't care whether you were authoritarian, libertarian, or vegetarian, okay? But if you want to sell us deep goods, we actually don't share the same values. For me to have a Huawei chatbot in my bedroom, or for me to have Huawei 5G in my sidewalks. And so that's where we are right now. That the lack of basically shared values between us and China, when they want to sell us deep goods, now really matters. And so I fear, if you ask me what is my meta fear of the moment, it's that we've just ended 40 actually pretty peaceful years for the world, relatively, in terms of great power conflict. We may be sitting at a moment where those 40 years of great power peace, which brought a lot of stability and a lot of prosperity to a lot of people, not equally, but for the world as a whole, that era is gone. And you will miss it when it's gone. And that's why I struggle with you know, what China is doing, because I think it's a huge mistake for China, and it's a huge mistake for the world that this is where we go. Because to disconnect in a connected world, that's a really dangerous and destabilizing thing. And that's, I just wish I could sit down with Xi and say, what are you doing? You know, there was a reason Deng Xiaoping said you should only rule for 2 terms, and you now want to be president for life. Putin wants to be president for life. And one of the things that we're also learning is all this great whiz-bang technology, you know, it actually makes inefficient authoritarians more efficient. It makes efficient authoritarians really efficient, and it makes democracies incredibly unstable. And that's the real challenge. You know, this Twitter, Facebook, all this stuff is actually destabilizing us. Well, they use the technology actually to get tighter and tighter control. And that is a very worrying trend for me.
Is that sort of the limit of Friedman-esque optimism?
That's where exactly, it's
I mean, because I just can't end.
That's right, I just, you know, I usually, you know, look for some lift, and I'm still basically an optimistic person, because I have readers who tell me, if you go dark, man, that's it. I'm going to shoot myself, you know. So I try to look on the bright side, but I'd be lying if I didn't say I just see some really, really worrying trends. And
But if Putin does the awful thing of taking Kiev, that might actually drive a wedge between the Chinese and the Russians.
Yeah, it will be very, very interesting because, you were making the point, I think it's so right, that China is actually not a revolutionary power. Look, they've produced a giant middle class now. They need trade. They need a stable global economy. And that's where they and Putin, they're sitting there, well, we'd like that Putin's annoying the Americans and tying them down or whatnot, but holy mackerel, this could really get out of control, And so it's very worrying, that where they will go with this. So I'm sitting here watching, hoping that cooler heads prevail. I'm going to end with a point about nature. Which are the most stable ecosystems in nature? Those that build complex adaptive networks, where all the elements of the ecosystem network together with healthy interdependencies. Those are the ones that basically survive when the climate changes. So I'm a big believer that in societies, the most stable societies are those that build complex adaptive coalitions, where all the elements of the community, could be local, state, or global, network together to maximize their resilience and propulsion. Now, the cement for healthy interdependencies is two things: truth and trust. Truth and trust. That's the cement. And one of my teachers, Dov Seidman, always says, we will judge leaders today whether you put more truth into the world than you took out of it, and whether you put more trust in the world than you took out of it. Those are really how I judge leaders. And I think Dov's exactly right about that. And what you just have to hope is that we will have a generation of leaders who put more truth into the world than they take out of it, and put more trust into the world than they take out of it.
Tom, you...
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Tom, you have put more truth and trust in our afternoon.
Well, thank you.
And I want to thank you for this extraordinary conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming. That was great. Really enjoyed that.
That was fun.
Really fun.
You did great.
Thank you.
Thank you.